Yeah. Welcome to another episode of CTO Alchemy. I'm Bryce Ominski, the Global Chief Technology Officer from Deep Dive World, also a Chief Architect with Weave. I'm a distinguished architect, and my guest today, Loudon Williams, is also a distinguished architect, a Weave Chief Architect, and he's the founder and principal from Ascendiant, a strategy company that helps Fortune 100 companies realize their strategy and IT alignment. Um, Laudon Williams has a really prolific career. He started as a signal analysis officer in the Army and worked his way through various things that included time at, work advising Fortune 100 companies on products and development with Microsoft, setting up programming with Microsoft, working with AWS as a cloud adoption framework. He's an author, he's an evangelist. He was a senior director at in the public service. He's worked with Walt Disney. He also has his own podcast, Shite I Learned the Hard Way. Um, Loudon, you have an amazing career, and I know we've talked a lot about strategy. I want to get into it. Is there anything I've missed in your career, though, that you want to add? Because I know there's a lot in there. So,
Well, you're very kind with what you have added. Yeah, I think the way I'd say it is I'm interested in building systems that help people um, execute well. And so that's led me down some interesting paths over the years. So I helped build a bunch of different reference architectures for Microsoft. And so a lot of my work has really been focused on how do we structure things in a way that everyone succeeds and we get what we want out of systems. And I just find that part of the problem to be fascinating. But I try very hard to stay very close and connected, make sure that I'm involved in execution as much as I am in theory, because theory without execution not that useful.
well, and that's interesting. So let's get started. I know we're going to get in, for the viewers, we're going to be talking about strategy. We're going to talk about getting results, but that's not really where this seems to have started. And we had a little bit of a discussion before we came on board. You did some really interesting stuff on optimists versus pessimists, culture, and the importance of culture. And that's almost seems to be a starting point. Can you kind of comment on that and why it's so important to not have pessimists in your organization?
It's an interesting problem. I'll tell you where the theory started to become really apparent to me. I've used a model, and it's maybe not the sharpest model, but often when I talk about resources in human capital with executives, talking about at some point the way you get expertise is you buy it, you rent it, or you make it. And by buy it, I mean you go hire someone on the market with the expertise. They're your employee. You rent it. You go to a firm, bring them in, or you make it. And that means you take existing resources you have and you continually develop them and you ensure that they can be used for. And I would work with companies that I'll say I worked with one company that was a public utility company. And I explained it to them like this. I said, the problem you have is you're going to go to career day at a nice university to get you some fantastically freshly minted career experts out. And there's going to be the AWS booth, the Microsoft booth, the Google booth, and there's probably going to be the Accentures and the McKinseys and the Slaloms and everyone else. And you're going to be at the end booth there with your public service company. And who's coming to your booth? Well, it's the person who no one else gave, got no bite from. I talked to everybody, and so I'm like, so you're starting in a position where you're not interesting, you're not sexy, you're not the type of organization people want to work for. So that means it becomes incumbent on you to really focus heavily on developing your own talent. And the thing you learn really quick is that some organizations have a very pessimistic view of human capital and talent. In fact, I think one of the big measures you see often is if you have to cut. If I tell you go cut 10% out of your budget, and you got 10% of your current budget's training, I can promise you what's going to go first. Or
Yeah.
if it's employee development, I can promise you the first thing you're going to cut out of your budget is going to be training or employee development. Yet I think a well-developed employee. I mean, there's so much research and expertise that it costs so much less to retrain an employee and empower employees costs to. And so that was part of it, but it also is more than that. It's just understanding that this is deep in the philosophy of a company, and you can't escape it. So if your company has this sort of humans or cogs and people are tokens and they are roughly interchangeable, I personally believe you're at a competitive disadvantage because the people who do better for it get better benefits, um, they have happier employees, etc.
And it's interesting. So you particularly focused on like a culture, I guess the optimist, and you define it a little bit differently than other people. I think it's I liked your approach. Like you talk about mindset and capital resources. What are some of the characteristics in a culture that if a company wants to achieve its mission, that they should look for in terms of building a optimistic culture?
I think you're hitting a really important topic, and it kind of comes to something that I believe very fundamental. And I believe that, and I'm going to say it succinctly, and we can talk more about it. But I believe that an organization, and I'm saying organization meaning public sector, private sector, NGO,
Yep.
doesn't matter, but an organization inherently exists to accomplish a mission. What they all share in common is they have finite resources which to accomplish that mission. And we could presume, I think everyone instantly goes to capital, but I think the average organization has more than capital, right? You
Yep.
have money, capital, but you also have human capital, you have information, and you have technology. And if you are a fiduciary of the company, it's your job to hold stewardship over the best use of those resources,
Yeah.
right? And so what I'm driving back to is that if you are cynical of human capital, you are removing from your equation, your value equation, essentially human capital is a meaningful contributor to your ability to execute your mission. And that seems really counterproductive and counterintuitive to me. It feels like you want to, what I mean by optimism, I should probably say this explicitly. What I mean by optimism is you have an optimistic view of humans. You
Yeah.
believe that humans they can achieve, they can do that in the right circumstances or do well and exceed expectations. It is possible to make people happy and yet still reap very real benefits. Accomplishes it. So that's really how it came into being. As I was looking at it and really saying, it's like I don't know that you can um, minimize or be cynical about human capital. Yet there are big companies where that is a hallmark. I mean, we're living in a world where Tesla's laying off
Yeah.
people left and right from an incredibly cynical view of people are lazy and you're not contributing enough. Um, Look, I mean, there are hyperscalers in our market who I won't call out who are quite well known for having a all people are cogs mentality.
Yeah.
And it just feels to me, I say it feels to me, but I think it's not just a feeling. I mean, there's a lot of empirical evidence that really supports the fact that organizations that have this optimistic, this faith in humanity, and to get more out of employees, better at
I
executing.
think that's a really great observation. I'm just going to add to that point, Loudon. I was listening today to Alex Karp talk about his team at Palantir. And really, you can talk when he talks about it with such passion, what great people he have. You really see that, and I think you actually see that in their strategy too, right?
Yeah.
And that kind of brings us to our next issue. How do we get? And we'll probably come back more to the culture, but how do you get to getting a good strategy in place that aligns IT? And I'm going to sort of get to this story. I love you. Like I love when you tell it. So you can only say it your way, Loudon. But it's like, why do we even care about aligning our strategy with the business? Why don't we just get a good IT plan going?
Yeah.
And there we go.
Yeah, and I think this is critical. And if you don't mind, just taking the model I presented. So think of it this way: if my job is to accomplish my mission, all organizations exist for the sole purpose of accomplishing their mission. That's what
Yeah.
defines an organization. And I have finite resources. I'm going to stipulate a couple of things to kind of get to answer your question. I would stipulate that um, a fiduciary's job is to use those resources in a way that most efficiently or effectively accomplishes the mission. Okay?
Yeah.
that means as you decompose through strategy, there's only one strategy in a company. I mean, you might have division level strategies if you're a huge multinational or something, but the test is really simple, and the test is, if I go in front of Wall Street with my quarterly report, and if I say to them, we are 100% red and did not meet a single one of our strategic objectives. However, it's very important for you to know that we are green across the board on our IT card. No one cares. Literally, no one cares. And I would take that a step further and say there can be more detriment to the mindset that says IT has a strategy than advantage, in my opinion. And I'll say why. Because IT is an enabler of business. HR is an enabler of business. They are enablers. And by feeling that you have a strategy, you can very easily become divorced from the organizational strategy and your role as an enabler of the organization's strategy. You can lose that beat. I've said for years, I said, I think in a weird way, and I know us that are architects that talk about this stuff love to argue over things, and this is one of my maybe not as well received opinions. But I said maybe an EA isn't really an enterprise architect. Maybe it's the enablement architect. Maybe what an EA's job is really to do is to understand the systems that are enabling the organization's strategy, help to optimize how those organizations are aligned to driving that value. And I'll tell you a trick in what I just said.
Mhm.
I just gave you a definition of value that you're not going to see in too many places, and it's a really simple one. This definition of value is it is a good investment if it helps the organization accomplish their mission more efficiently or effectively. And that's really an interesting mindset because that helps to align you to what it is you're really supposed to be doing, which is enabling. I don't need an IT fiefdom. I don't need a contracts fiefdom.
Well,
They're
that's actually
absolutely
really interesting, Loudon. You really hit something really critical for me here, and it's the word fiefdom. So you've probably seen this too. I've been in organizations, we go into a strategic planning exercise, and a year later they're still in the throes of it. It's gotten bogged down in immense complexity. Sometimes organizations have come up with hundreds of KPIs, and they've taken so long. And this seems to be at odds with your philosophy, in that you're really about lightweight governance, from what I understand, and getting to results quickly.
yes.
Do we really need to take that long?
No.
And how do we accelerate it?
So I love the question. I'm going to tee this up. I love the way you asked it, but I'm going to tee it up with a conversation just because I think it's fascinating. I had a good friend of mine who is a management science expert. And by expert, I mean he was one of Deming's students. There's not too many
Okay.
people I know that know more about management science than him. And he used to give me a really hard time. He said, you know why IT's just gonna fail ultimately? And I said, why? And he says, because we have 30 years of management science knowledge that they completely ignore and just figure that they know better. And I thought it was kind of a little bit mean, but he was right, right? He was right. And so here we are all these years later, and what's the current buzzword du jour? OKRs. Everyone's OKRing,
Yeah, yeah.
which is cool. I'm glad to see we finally caught up with what management science knew 30 years ago. So, but at the same time, management science has to take a little bit of a learning from IT. We've learned to be agile. I'm not saying we're great at it. I'm not saying every organization's even good at it, but we conceptually understand that IT can be faster than it has to be. But management science has not learned to be faster. It has not learned to be more agile. And while I'm not a conspiracy theorist, I would say that the organizations that primarily control strategic initiatives within major organizations,
Yep.
consulting firms that do so, have a wonderful economic advantage for strategic planning and strategic initiatives to require 10 to 15 high priced MBAs over 6 months minimum to come up with something. But we can also test that and prove that that's not fast enough. And we can look back at the pandemic and look at what happened when everyone had to throw out their 3 and 5 year strategy plans and completely and totally pivot. And we can see the bodies of the companies that were not able to do that and collapsed under their own weight. So we know that. And right now we're seeing it. And we're seeing it with AI right now, this minute. We may not all agree on what AI will be, but we will all agree 1 year from today, when we're having this conversation, it will be inherently different. The market will be inherently different, and the world will be inherently different.
Yeah.
And what does that do to your 3-year strategy window? What does that do to your 5-year strategy window? It means that you need the ability to rapidly adjust strategy, or not adjust so much strategy, but adjust enablement. Sometimes it's adjust strategy, but at the very least, you need a super agile ability to adjust the way you enable the business or the organization, is, or since that's a little bit more encompassing. And so that's our issue right now. Our issue is that we have this problem where there's a big incentive to make the sort of strategic direction process complex and cumbersome and big, at a time where we've seen two major trends in the market in as little as 5 years that invalidate the whole concept of a plan that would realistically probably last more than about a year or two.
So, what do we do about this? I mean, there may be more options. I see two major options. The first one is we start planning really fast. We come to the table with really rapid iterations. The second one is we say, look, maybe we can't plan that fast, but we can build in resilient architectures and build in business agility. I don't know if there's a third option or a fourth option, but what's your recommendation on that whole thing?
So I'll come at it. I agree with the two things you said or as
Yeah.
options, but I'm gonna come at it in a slightly different angle, and I'm
Yeah.
gonna pick on OKRs for a second.
Yeah.
And I would pose this question even to you, Bryce. I mean, is it possible to to have a completely well structured, by the definition of what makes a structured OKR, that delivers no strategic value to the organization? Is that possible?
On my first glance, I would say that would not achieve much.
But it's possible to do it.
I think a
No,
lot of people do it inadvertently as a mistake, right?
They do, and
Yes.
that's what I'm getting at. I have seen, and I'm sure you have too. I
Yeah.
have looked at more OKRs than I can count on hands, feet, and everything, right?
Yeah.
And there's a super low percentage of them that are towed to value and strategy, or are towed to value and mission. So
Yeah.
I would posit a little bit that maybe while OKRs are good, maybe they're not the most effective. Now, I'm not saying I have the answer, but I'm going to propose
Yeah.
something. See, what I believe is, in fact, I'm dying to do that. I've done this experiment in small scale. I'm dying to do this at a very large, like, enterprise scale, because I would bet dollars to donuts this will change. Here's what you need to do for me if you want to engage a program, an initiative, or a project. Present me with a value hypothesis. And that value hypothesis is really simple. I believe that the investment of blank resource into this initiative, as defined, will help drive the following metrics and measures that result in a positive directional increase in this upstream strategic measure.
Well, hold on a second here. Hold on. What's the difference between this and just doing a business case? How is that different than a traditional business case?
People who know me well know that business case is a very baity conversation for me, because I think that business cases are an artifact of a time. Now, I got to be careful about this so I don't get in trouble with these. I think that you don't need a business case to effectively drive and achieve strategic value in an organization.
Okay.
I think you can replace a lot of what business cases do. This isn't, understand, I'm not talking market analysis
Yep.
and that sort of stuff. I'm just saying, like, when we make people do business cases for internal programs and initiatives, I think they're fluffy and they're speculative. They're guessing at what might happen. And if we turn that around for a minute and think about it and what we know about agile, see, the beauty of a value hypothesis is they're testable, because one of those metrics we talked about is that you want to say how this measure, if you can influence this measure, it will have a positive influence on this strategic measure. So that's the key of a value. So you can't screw this one up like you can in OKR, because you have to.
I
You
see.
have to
And so this is really coming down to, this is really come from what I hear you saying. It's a lot more succinct.
Yes.
It's experimental.
Yes.
And what I'm going to sort of ask you, does this mean that from that value hypothesis, we can go right to key performance indicators and measures and drive those
Absolutely.
out?
Have to.
Okay.
You have to. And I'll say this: the idea behind it is generate a lot of value hypotheses, build a system to allow you to test them rapidly, 2 to 3 weeks. There are a lot of very well established systems for doing that.
Yeah.
Google Ventures has a system that was great. It's called, I think, Sprint book. I might be wrong with the book name, but there's a lot of them out
What was
there
that
that
called? Sorry, I missed
I
that.
think it's Sprint. I might have the wrong word. It's the Google Ventures method for 1 week
Okay.
rapid value testing.
Gotcha.
I might have the wrong name, but the
Okay.
idea behind it is there are ways, well recognized systems for being able to do this. So what I'm advocating for is not that every value hypothesis is right. What I'm advocating for is you build a lot of value hypotheses, you run them through and test them like you do with real hypotheses. You decommit out of the ones that don't work and you double down on the ones that do. And I would, if I was king of the world, I would say any initiative or program or project you want to start begins with a value hypothesis and a test. So you can show me that, yet, in fact, this will have a strategic impact on our organization in a positive way. And you know what? If it doesn't work, go retool it and try it again. Test it. Don't get out of that initial phase, because I'm not giving you real funding until you prove it's something useful. But once you do, I'm going to help you. I'm going to give you what you need to make it happen. And that's where, by the way, enablement comes into play, because at that point, I now have to enable your ability to make this happen, make sure that it's there. And so they do tie together. Now, KPIs, I'm going to say one last thing about this.
Yep.
What I see too often in short-term projects, like my favorite one are ROIs, ROI for a project. I got a 6-month project with a 3-year ROI window. And my goal, according to my value measure I gave, is this will keep this ROI. We're making us ROI. So I do a 6 months project, and what do? Sit around for the next, year and a 2.5 years, waiting around to see if I got ROI. My only measure in that case, because I tied it to ROI, is whether or not I got ROI, and that's a long term. That's a lagging indicator.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
And,
so
and
when
you're
I
not
look
going
at
to know
leading
up front. I mean,
indicators,
you're not going to see that right away. Like,
no,
so
no,
lagging indicators are not good experimental
no,
material. Like,
no.
yeah.
So that means you have to decompose it to a leading indicator, but even more important, you need to decompose it into something I call a proofing indicator. And the idea behind it is you need to identify a measure that you believe you can influence in your 3-week test or your 2-week test. What do I think I get? Is it usability? Is it, what is it?
Yeah.
You propose it and you go try it. And if you move it, the sort of syllogism becomes, um, if I can move this, then it should move my leading indicator. And if I can move my leading indicator in a positive way, it should ultimately result in my lagging indicator moving in a positive way. But we get so myopically caught up on lagging indicators, or even leading indicators that are hard to prove fast. And by fast, I mean within, I'm going to say 90 days. I don't think you can typically wait more than 90 days. I think 90 days is too long personally, but let's just say 90 days.
Yeah.
Most of the leading indicators I see people trying to march to take a year. Yeah, you're measuring your leading indicators as you slide into performance review season in the average company, right? It's like, let's see if we got it.
Yeah. And that's actually challenging. And, I sort of have a related question. So
Sure.
when you do all the strategy alignment, there's a whole bunch of models that have been in place. We have things like business models, which are, sorry, not business, business cases, which are sort of lengthy. They're, we need to sort of, substitute an agile component. And sometimes what I've come across is companies that want to build out a target operating model for their future, and they want to go to detail and do it. And it's falling out of favor. I'm not a fan of it necessarily. What are your thoughts on that? Is that a useful exercise, or are we better off to stay to more traditional strategic alignment factors like KPIs and follow those?
I mean, I think, you must objectively demonstrate value.
Yeah.
You have to do that in a way that's objective. And so metrics and KPIs measures are useful in that. And I think we understand, we may not use them well, but at least we understand them conceptually. Um, the risk you run with too many other things is solidifying something that shouldn't be solidified. I mean, maybe if you don't mind, let me take a side on this one, just because I
Sure.
think this is a really important point that I see a lot, and I think it answers your question
Yeah.
to a maybe better. I would stipulate that a lot of how organizations operate are based on constraints that used to exist that don't exist today.
Wow.
Okay, so I'm gonna give you an example because you have the same hair color as I have, or beard color. How about that, Bryce?
Oh, I'll
So,
take that's a real compliment. Thank you.
so, so think of it this way. So we all grew up in the days of POCs in the 90s, right? Why were POCs a pain in the ass? Well, you had to spend the spreadsheet, right? I'm gonna have to spend a lot of time theorizing. All of I had to get lab time, potentially purchase lab equipment, get licenses. So to de-risk POCs, we had to jump through a bunch of hoops, all these calculations. Is this POC gonna do? We had all this stuff built around it, and it made that process extremely slow. But at some point that constraint went away. We don't have big, huge, test labs and enterprises anymore. I mean, might still, but we typically don't. What do? We spin up an ephemeral environment in the cloud really quick. We go test some stuff, and when we're done, we shut it down. So what that means is that in the amount of time it took you to produce the business case and the
Yeah.
Excel spreadsheet to get lab time to do a POC, you've already conducted a value proofing test and you're done before you could have ever gotten through that process. But we still are stuck in that mindset. We're still stuck in this mindset of there's all of these constraints on my ability to go fast. And I'm going to tell you, I genuinely believe for a lot of those purposes, those constraints no longer exist. We're just
Oh,
caught up in how we've done the gravity of how we've done stuff for so long is so strong that we have a hard time moving past that. And now I'm saying that because the challenge you run into is a lot of these concepts, these operating model concepts, were built around a lot of operating constraints
yeah.
and a lot of different things that don't exist anymore. And when you think back to how long some of these basic things have existed, I mean, a lot of what we think of as a modern operational stack has been around since the 2000s, the early 2000s. I mean,
Yeah.
agile is not new. Template-based deployments is not new. These are old technologies that have been
Yeah.
around for a long time. They've just been packaged in better ways with better tooling. So what we're kind of getting at is we're not necessarily doing brand new things, but when we think about them well, how about that? We
Okay.
are thinking about them without previous bias and constraints, and we're using them better. But 90% of the organizations I work with are collapsing under the weight of constraints that no longer exist. But their entire systems, their systems of systems, are all constructed around artificial constraints and or antiquated. I don't want to say artificial because they were very real when they existed. They just don't exist anymore.
So, Loudon, I heard something very interesting. Somebody had said that a digital company can be one of the hardest companies to transform because of locked in culture. And I'm wondering how this applies to what you just said. I'm sort of thinking that you get a digital company, but they sort of buy into, well, I don't know what the right word is. I'll probably get in trouble for this, but kind of like voodoo. They believe in things from the past and they have these superstitions that they bring in with them to this digital thing, and then it becomes part of it. And that, from what I'm hearing, can inherently slow down their pace of change.
I think so, and it's an interesting context to put it in that sort of digital company context, but I think that's very important. Usually you have a tremendous amount of sunk cost, R&D costs, these
Yep.
sorts of things into core business systems. and you become almost scared to touch them because there's so much time, energy, and investment in them. And in a weird way, this ties back to something we talked about at the very beginning. The idea of Kaizen and continual improvement has been a
Yep.
hallmark of the Toyota TQM system since the 90s, right? This is not new stuff, 80s, 90s. This is not new stuff, right? We understand that you should inherently plan for iteration and continual improvement. And the number of times I'm in an organization that has a dysfunctional, acquisition system, or can't get anything accomplished, telling me how Kaizen they are and how they
Yeah.
constantly are, continually improving. It's like, I'm sure you are, by the letter of the law,
Yeah.
continually getting better. I don't believe you're meeting the spirit of what you're supposed to be doing with continual improvement. And we all fail at this, by the way. We're all bad
Yeah.
at it. I mean, we are bad at it because we're humans, and we like the comfort of things that are consistent and the same. And it's kind of counter to our own nature to constantly challenge our own beliefs and our own systems. So that's where understanding humans and understanding why humans might be resistant to those sorts of things becomes kind of paramount to being able to be successful.
Well, that's really interesting. Almost it's bringing us full circle now. Like what I heard you say is that the optimistic resources are the ones that are going to come in, are going to look at those constraints. They're going to be open to them. Am I kind of getting what you're getting at there?
You are now putting the pieces together exactly. So that's the whole idea. If your culture is don't screw this up,
Yeah.
then guess what your culture becomes? Highly static.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
That's
you
a good
see it
point.
symptomatically because you see pieces bolting, people are just bolting stuff on the old systems. They're Frankensteining, these old systems. But when you see a culture where I invest in people, I expose them to new ideas, I provide them with the ability. I mean, imagine if you had the ability, if you, Bryce, had the ability at any company you were at to be able to say, I've got a really cool idea for improving a system. I believe I have a value hypothesis for it. I'm going to state it. I'm going to go to my enablement architect. I'm going to stay with that, whether it's supposed to or not. And I'm going to say, I've got this wonderful idea. Here's my value hypothesis. And that person looks at it and says, this is cool. Here, go 3 weeks, go live over here and go test it out. I mean, how awesome would that be? If I was an employee, how good would that make me feel? I mean, like, I can literally take a strategic idea and test it. And by the way, that's also kind of good because if it doesn't work, I get to learn. I get to go,
Yeah.
maybe I didn't think about this well. Maybe I need to reseat and rethink about it. And maybe I need to learn more about how to
And
do
that
this,
gets
how to do
beyond
things.
failure as a form of blame to more of a
Yeah.
form of experimentation. That's really critical in what you're
Yes.
saying.
Yeah. Yeah. Basically, what we're trying to build is a system where you can't fail per se.
Yeah.
You just may not get optimal results out of what you're doing, and that's okay,
Yeah.
because you might get great results the next time. It's not about winning every time. In fact, when I coach, as you probably know, I have a method for generating value hypotheses that I've built over time. And when I run these with customers, I mean, they'll get 14, 15 value hypotheses, and they're excited because they're like, I got 14 things going to drive huge value. And I'm like, no, they won't, because you're not going to yield 14 out of those. In
I
fact,
see.
you're
Yeah.
going to be lucky if you yield 3, but I think you will. I think you'll yield about 3. 14, 3 is about right. I usually see about 30% yield. And so, but just that's what you're trying to do. There's no bad ideas. You just generate them, generate them, generate them. If I can make that cost of experimentation exceedingly low, if I lower than a formal R&D budget or something like that, if I
Yep.
can make it where I can go experiment for, 10, 20K a pop, I mean, like, why would I not do that? It's sort of like this is a this is a horrible analogy. It's sort of like investing in penny stocks. Every once in a while, one of them's going to blow up and
Yep.
be great. Don't invest in penny stocks, Bryce. That was a bad analogy.
Well, I wish I would have got Microsoft as a penny stock, but that's about it. So no, this is really interesting, and I'm really starting to get the connection. What is there any questions that I should be asking you about this,
Uh,
and bringing this in that I haven't asked yet?
yes, and I'll tell you the big piece to this. This is something else I've been working on for several years. And I'll give you a little bit of the history of it. So I created this thing called enablement chains, and the reason for it was I wanted to be able to expose the weakest link in the chain. That's the idea behind it, is understanding where your system is going to fail. And I'll give you a couple of real examples of where this hits in real world. And one of my favorites is this. I have a really good IT team that wants to do an agile project, and they bring in external help. They're going to go get a consulting or staff aug, whatever. They're going to go get people to come in and help them with this. And then you go to contracts and you find out contracts cannot contract an agile project, because an agile project may have different deliverables on day or week 4 than it had intended to have it at day 1, right? And so then you see contracts go, no, this has to be, deliverable based. I want to know what Word document you're going to give me at week 3 so I can make a payment milestone. Well, you just had your acquisitions, contracting, legal, whoever it happens to be. They're the weak link in your chain.
Yeah.
That they have constrained your ability to execute agilely. They have harmed your potential for actually accomplishing something, right?
Yeah.
And so the idea behind it, and maybe I'll say one more thing about it. It's not a completely unique idea. I think I took it in a different direction. Goldrat's theory of constraints, I've always been enamored with. And one of the things I've been enamored with in particular is the current reality tree, which is a problem decomposition to root cause method, right? But theory of constraints and current reality tree does something that almost no other decomp system does, which is it circles your sphere of control. So it helps you recognize that sometimes I can't touch root cause because I don't have sphere of control there. And so you draw your circle of what you can influence, and you can see how much of the problem you can eliminate within your sphere of control.
Yeah.
And it's always bothered me that why can't you get to that root cause? And that's, in a weird way, what I tried to shift this around to is it's like, instead of saying, and I love this, by the way, this is not a criticism of theory of constraints. I love the concept of my sphere of influence, but at the same time, I'm kind of like, you have to make visible. It does. I think there's other ways to make it visible, but you have to make visible that there are enabling components. That's why enablement becomes important of the system that are going to be the weak link in your chain. It could be hiring. It could be onboarding.
Yeah.
I've got 20 great employees that are going to be perfect for this project. Unfortunately, it's going to take us 6 months to onboard them. So it's looking at all those aspects. And I try to focus it from the lens of those resources that we apply efficiently and effectively. So I structured it around that concept of capital, human capital, information, and technology. That's how I structure it.
But that's a great point, Laudon, because a lot of times we go into an organization, we're trying to be an architect, we're trying to do something, we want to get something out. And I mean, I can tell you, one of the examples you gave really, I just have to go through procurement now. And this should take me 2 weeks literally to do, but procurement is backlogged and it takes me 6 months. And there it goes, right? And I mean, but it seems to me, and this is the question, is my sphere of influence doesn't touch procurement. Does that mean I need to build relationships in my organization with people whose spheres of influence can correct that?
That's correct. Well, I think step 1 is making it visible, because I think people don't always see the connections, right? People don't like. I say this as someone who spent the first part of my career in security and had a very beautiful career in information security. Enjoyed my time there; it was great. But I'm very critical of security teams within enterprises, because they are the bottleneck, and they don't have to be, but they are. And so I think the answer is, if you don't expose that in the right way, see, because you're enabling something is a coordination of a lot of different components. And if you either are unaware of all the components, by the way, that's why people fail. They didn't know that contracts couldn't contract to something agile. They didn't know that HR couldn't hire resources for 9 months and get them ready to work in 9 months, for less than 9 months, by the way, to say it. So they know all this stuff. So I think step 1 is understand your interdependencies and what you need to enable something. Understand how that looks temporally, which is a lot of what I do in enablement chains. And then what you're doing at that point. And this is why the value becomes so important, because what you're showing the organization is you're saying, we did our tests. We did our proof. We know this is going to drive value, but we're not going to drive that value if the system is constraining us.
Yeah.
And so you're trying to see, this is why value proofing is so important, Bryce, is because it's all, I can say I could do great things if you would let me. That's the worst argument and to any executive in the world. Oh yeah, I'm gonna just let you go do whatever you want to. But how much more powerful is that? Is we established a value hypothesis, we tested it.
Yes.
We need to now we need to do it, and we need to enable it. To enable it, this is what that looks like. These 5 parts of our system are constraints on the system. They're going to make us
Right.
slow. They're going to prevent us from being able to get see now. Oh boy, now I'm an executive who owns that upstream
Well, and
strategy
it's interesting.
OKR. I
The
care.
root is still, yeah, I'm going to do this if you let me. But then it goes on to say, this is what I need you to do to let me get this
Yes.
done. And
But it's
it
also
sounds
saying
like,
you're going to let me do this because I've already established that this has a huge potential value to the
yes,
organization. And the
yes,
person, the executive who owns the OKR that just accrued to, just
yeah,
became your best friend in the world.
gotcha. That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah,
Loudon, this is awesome. We covered a lot of ground
we
today.
did.
Um, as always, this has been great. Thank you so much for joining us today. And Loudon, we're done.
Thank you.